$2.1 billion in shareholder value erased in 5 trading days. Pension funds that hold Ford stock lost money. Retirement accounts with Ford exposure lost money. The auto worker who has Ford shares in her 401k watched her retirement savings shrink because of tariffs that her president told her would make her industry stronger. Ford's CFO held an emergency investor call. The key quote from that call, which sent another shiver through the market: "We are evaluating all options, including potential production restructuring, to manage tariff-related cost increases that we did not anticipate and cannot fully absorb." In corporate language, production restructuring means plant closures are on the table. That's Ford's own CFO telling investors that the company may have to shut down American factories because of American trade policy. GM's stock fell 10% in the same period. $1.8 billion in market cap destruction. The Oshawa Assembly Plant, one of GM's most productive Canadian operations, a plant that the community fought to keep open when GM threatened to close it in 2019, is now caught in a tariff crossfire that makes cross-border component flow uneconomic. GM CEO testified before a Senate committee, warning that current tariff levels are incompatible with the integrated North American manufacturing model that this industry has operated under for 40 years. She wasn't requesting a favor, she was stating a fact. The model doesn't work with these tariffs. The math is the math. The Canadian sales collapse compounds the financial damage in ways that will take years to repair. Canada is Ford and GM's second largest market after the domestic U.S. market. Canadian counter-tariffs on American-built vehicles, 25 to 30%, have made Ford and GM products dramatically more expensive for Canadian consumers virtually overnight. And Canadian consumers responded exactly the way economics predicts. They switched. Toyota builds in Ontario, no tariff. Honda builds in Ontario, no tariff. Hyundai and Kia imports from South Korea, not subject to Canadian counter-tariffs on American goods. Ford F-150 sales in Canada dropped 34% in the first month after the counter-tariffs took effect. 34%. The best-selling vehicle in America is becoming uncompetitive in its second-largest market. GM's Silverado and Equinox face identical pressure. Combined, Ford and GM are projecting Canadian revenue losses of $870 million annually. Canadian consumers didn't boycott Ford and GM out of patriotism. They switched because tariffs made American-built vehicles 30% more expensive. The math made the decision for them. Production slowdowns are hitting hardest in the factory towns that can absorb them least. 3 Ford plants are running reduced shifts. Dearborn, Michigan, where the F-150 is built, Louisville, Kentucky, where the Escape and Corsair are assembled, and Kansas City, Missouri, where the Transit van is produced. 2 GM plants are affected. Flint, Michigan, running the Silverado heavy-duty line, and Wentzville, Missouri, producing the Colorado and Canyon. The cause is a combination of Canadian parts delayed at the border. Customs processing times have tripled since the tariffs took effect, and Canadian suppliers beginning to redirect capacity to other customers. A plant running 1 shift instead of 3 doesn't produce a third of the output at a third of the cost. It produces a third of the output at higher per unit cost, because the fixed costs, the building, the machinery, the heating and cooling systems, the management, the maintenance crews, those don't change when you send 2/3 of your workers home. Emergency sourcing is the final layer of financial damage, and it reveals just how irreplaceable the Canadian supply chain is. Both companies are scrambling to find non-Canadian suppliers for components previously sourced from Ontario and Quebec. Alternative suppliers exist in Mexico, Europe, and Asia, but at 15 to 40% higher cost with longer lead times and with quality control uncertainties that take months to resolve. Some components have no immediate alternative at all. Specialized castings, precision machined parts, specific alloy formulations that Canadian suppliers have perfected over decades of partnership. You can't replace a supplier you've been working with for 30 years in 30 days. The tooling is different. The specifications are different. The quality control protocols are different. Ford and GM are learning, at a cost of nearly $500 million in emergency procurement premiums, that supply chain relationships built over decades cannot be rebuilt in weeks. And all of this became dramatically worse when Canada's retaliatory strike landed, because it wasn't broad retaliation, it was surgical, precise, targeted with the kind of strategic calculation that turns economic damage into political devastation. Ottawa could have retaliated with blanket tariffs on American goods across every sector. That's the conventional response in a trade war. Match the other side's tariffs category for category, dollar for dollar. But Carney's trade team didn't go conventional. Instead, they targeted the auto sector specifically, with the precision of a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer. The reason was both strategic and political, and once you see the logic, you can't unsee it. The auto industry is the most visible American manufacturing sector. the one average Americans actually think about when they think about making things. It's the most politically sensitive in terms of geography, concentrated in Midwest swing states that decide presidential elections, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, and it's the industry Trump specifically, personally, and repeatedly promised to protect. He held rallies in auto plants. He posed next to pickup trucks. He told factory workers their jobs were safe with him. Canada didn't just retaliate. Canada chose the one industry where retaliation would do maximum political damage to the specific person who started the trade war. It was targeting with a purpose. Carney's trade minister said it publicly, and the directness was stunning. "We don't seek to harm ordinary Americans, but we will ensure that the consequences of tariff policy are felt most directly by the communities whose political representatives chose this path." The translation was unmistakable. Your voters elected the tariff president. Your voters will feel the tariff consequences. We're not punishing America, we're creating accountability. The counter tariffs on American-built vehicles, 25 to 30%, priced Ford and GM out of the Canadian market almost overnight. That was layer one. Painful but conventional. Layer two is what makes the damage structural and potentially permanent. Canada announced a $2.3 billion incentive package specifically for non-American automakers to expand their Canadian operations. Toyota's Cambridge and Alliston plants, which already build the RAV4 and Civic for the North American market, are eligible for expansion funding. Honda's Alliston operations eligible. Hyundai's potential new Ontario plant, a project that had been in preliminary discussions, suddenly fast-tracked with provincial and federal support. Volkswagen's St. Thomas battery plant eligible for additional capacity incentives. And crucially, Canadian Tier 1 suppliers, Magna International, Linamar, Martinrea, the companies that actually make the precision components that feed assembly plants, were given targeted tax incentives to redirect production capacity away from Ford and GM and toward these new non-American customers. Think about what that means in practice. The parts that used to flow from Ontario factories to Michigan assembly lines for Ford and GM vehicles are now being offered to Toyota and Honda for assembly in Ontario. Same factories making the parts. Same skilled workers running the machines. Same quality standards. Different customers. And the Canadian government is paying the suppliers to make the switch. That's not retaliation in the traditional sense. That's industrial restructuring funded by government policy. And once those supplier relationships shift, once Magna signs a 5-year contract with Toyota, once Linamar retools a production line for Honda specifications, they don't shift back because an American president changes his mind about tariffs. The tooling has changed. The contracts are signed. The workers have been retrained. The shift is permanent. Magna International, the largest Canadian auto parts manufacturer and one of the largest in the world, used to dedicate roughly 70% of its North American capacity to Ford and GM programs. That number is already declining as Magna signs new contracts with Toyota, Hyundai, and Volkswagen. The company's CEO told investors that supply chain stability is the single most important factor in our customer relationships, and we are reallocating capacity toward partners who offer that stability. He didn't name Ford and GM. He didn't need to. Everyone understood who no longer offered stability. The Oshawa irony makes the story almost unbearable. GM's Oshawa assembly plant was nearly closed in 2019. Workers marched through the streets. The community rallied. Politicians from every party intervened. Unifor, the Canadian Auto Workers Union, negotiated desperately. The plant was saved, celebrated as a victory for Canadian auto workers and their families, a symbol of what communities can achieve when they fight for their livelihoods. Now that same plant is being hollowed out by the trade war, not because Canada doesn't want it, not because the workers aren't skilled or the facility isn't productive, because American tariffs have made it economically impossible to operate as part of GM's integrated cross-border manufacturing system. The plant the community fought to save is being killed by a trade war that started 3,000 kilometers away in a White House press conference. And then Warren Buffett was asked about Ford and GM at a Berkshire board meeting, and his response was unlike anything he's delivered in this entire sequence. Every previous Buffett statement in this crisis has been measured, clinical, professorial, philosophical, even mournful. This one was different. This one was angry. Not explosive or performative, the controlled, quiet fury of a man who has loved American industry for 7 decades and is watching it be destroyed by the people who claim to champion it most loudly. He paused before speaking, removed his glasses, put them back on. The room went silent. People who know Buffett recognized the body language. He was preparing to say something he knew would be consequential and that he knew would hurt. "What I'm about to say may sound harsh," he began, "but it's honest. And right now, honesty is more useful than comfort. Ford and General Motors are not ordinary companies, he said. They built the American middle class. They won World War II, literally won it, by converting their factories to produce the tanks and bombers and military trucks that carried Allied soldiers to victory. They defined what this country means to the rest of the world, what American manufacturing means, what American ingenuity means, what the American dream looks like when it actually has wheels under it. And they are now being destroyed. Not by Chinese competition, not by Tesla, not by electric vehicles or autonomous driving or any technological disruption, by the trade policy of their own government. Their own government. He let that last phrase hang in the air for 3 full seconds before continuing. I've been investing in American industry since 1956. 69 years. Through recessions, oil crises, financial panics, and a global pandemic. I have never seen an American president inflict this much damage on American manufacturing in this short a period of time. You don't tariff your own flagships. You don't impose costs on the companies that employ your voters, anchor your communities, and define your national identity to every other nation on earth. It's the industrial policy equivalent of burning down your own house to kill a mouse. The mouse escapes, the house doesn't. Then he made it personal in a way that only someone who actually operates industrial infrastructure can. I see this from both sides, he said. The NSF Railway, which Berkshire owns, moves auto parts across the US-Canada border every single day. Those rail cars are how engine blocks get from Ontario to Ohio, how transmissions get from Windsor to Dearborn, how the integrated North American auto supply chain actually functions in physical reality. Our rail volumes on cross-border auto shipments are down 23% since the tariffs took effect, 23% fewer rail cars carrying parts that Ford and GM plants need to operate. He leaned forward in his chair. Every rail car that doesn't cross the border is a production line that runs slower in Michigan. Every production line that runs slower is a shift that gets cut. Every shift that gets cut is a worker who goes home early. Every worker who goes home early is a family that earns less, that spends less at the grocery store, that worries about making the mortgage payment. I can trace the damage from the tariff announcement straight through the supply chain to the kitchen table of a Ford worker in Dearborn. The chain is that direct. There are no abstractions here. These are real rail cars, real production lines, real families. His warning about permanence was the most devastating part of the entire statement, because it addressed the question nobody in Washington wants to confront. Can this be undone? What Canada is doing right now, redirecting its auto parts capacity to Japanese and Korean automakers, with $2.3 billion in government incentives to accelerate the shift. That's the damage that doesn't heal, he said. Stock prices recover when sentiment improves, production can restart when parts arrive, but when your supply chain partner builds new relationships with your competitors, retools their production lines for different specifications, signs multi-year contracts, and gets paid by their own government to make the switch, that relationship is gone. It's not sleeping. It's gone. The tariffs broke the trust. Canada's strike redirected the business. And redirected business doesn't come back because you apologize. It doesn't come back because you reverse the tariff 6 months from now. It comes back only if you can offer better terms, better stability, and better reliability than the new customer. And right now, Toyota and Honda are offering all three, backed by a government that isn't going to change its trade policy every time a new president takes office. The final line will define this entire episode. You don't tariff your own flagships. And once they're sinking, you don't get them back by admitting you shouldn't have opened the holes. Now let me take you to the factory floors, because this is where $59 billion stops being a number on a spreadsheet and starts being a life. These are the stories that the stock tickers and analyst downgrades and Senate hearings never capture. The human dimension of what happens when trade policy meets a Tuesday morning. In Dearborn, Michigan, at Ford's Rouge complex where the F-150 is built, the most iconic production facility in American manufacturing history. The plant Henry Ford himself designed, the third shift has been eliminated. Until supply chain conditions normalize, according to the notice posted on the break room wall, 1,400 workers from that shift are now on temporary layoff. Management used the word temporary. The workers are not optimistic about that characterization. A Ford worker with 22 years at the company, a man who started on the line the year after September 11th and has built trucks through 2 recessions, a semiconductor shortage, and a global pandemic, was interviewed by the Detroit Free Press. I voted for Trump because he said he'd save manufacturing, he said. I believed him. My whole family believed him. Now I'm home on a Tuesday watching my bills pile up because his tariff shut down my shift. I still have my mortgage. I still have my car payment. I still have 2 kids who need braces and a wife who just got her hours cut at the hospital because patient volume is down. Tell me how that's saving manufacturing. Because from where I'm sitting on my couch at 2 in the afternoon, it looks like he's killing it. Dearborn's municipal budget depends on income tax revenue from auto workers. Fewer shifts means less income, means less tax revenue, means reduced city services. The city manager told local media that projected revenue shortfalls could mean deferred road maintenance, reduced snowplowing routes in winter, shorter library hours, and delayed upgrades to the city's water infrastructure. The damage radiates outward from the plant gate like ripples from a stone. Restaurants lose lunch customers. Gas stations lose fill-ups. Daycare centers lose enrollment as parents who've been laid off keep children home. In Flint, Michigan, the situation is even more precarious because Flint has already been pushed to the edge so many times that there's barely any edge left to stand on. The water crisis devastated public trust. Decades of deindustrialization hollowed out the tax base. Population declined from over 200,000 to under 100,000. The Flint assembly plant producing the Silverado HD and Sierra HD was one of the last remaining economic anchors keeping the city from total collapse. Now it's running reduced production. Workers are being offered voluntary separation packages, corporate language for buyouts that typically precede involuntary layoffs when not enough people accept the voluntary offer. A UAW local president in Flint told NBC, "This city has been through hell. Literally through hell. Our children were poisoned by their own water. The plant was our lifeline. The one thing that kept people here, kept families together, kept hope alive, and tariffs are cutting that lifeline. Flint cannot absorb another major economic blow. The water crisis nearly killed the city. GM Assembly was the life support that kept it breathing. And the tariffs just put the life support on a timer that nobody in Washington seems to be watching." In Lordstown, Ohio, the cruelty reaches a level that borders on parody. GM closed the original Lordstown assembly plant in 2019, devastating a community that had built its entire identity around the facility for half a century. Families left, small businesses closed, property values collapsed, schools lost enrollment. Then Lordstown Motors, an electric vehicle startup, took over part of the facility. New technology, new jobs, new hope for a community that had been written off. But Lordstown Motors' EV production depends on battery components sourced through Canadian critical mineral supply chains. Tariffs on Canadian critical minerals make those components significantly more expensive, threatening the economic model of the entire operation. Lordstown lost GM. It was given Lordstown Motors as a second chance, a resurrection story for the post-industrial Midwest. Now tariffs are threatening to take that second chance away. The same community hit twice by the same trade policy logic. In 5 years, across Middle America, more than 3,000 Ford dealerships and over 4,000 GM and Chevrolet dealerships are watching their businesses deteriorate. Inventory values declining, consumer confidence dropping. Dealers in the Midwest reporting 15 to 20% sales declines as vehicle prices rise from tariff-inflated component costs. A third-generation Ford dealer in rural Indiana told the Wall Street Journal, "My grandfather started this dealership in 1961. My father ran it for 30 years. I've run it for 15. We've been through recessions, gas crises, the 2008 crash. We survived all of it. I'm not sure we survived this." Small-town dealerships aren't just businesses. They sponsor Little League teams, donate to churches and volunteer fire departments, employ the neighbors of the people they sell trucks to. When a Ford dealership closes in a town of 8,000 people, the town doesn't just lose a car lot, it loses a piece of its identity. And the truly invisible victims, the ones who will never be mentioned in a Senate hearing or an analyst report, are the Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers. A 45-person shop in Toledo that makes precision brackets for Ford transmissions has seen orders drop 40%. The owner, who took over from her father 15 years ago, told a local reporter she's 2 bad months from closing permanently. A 120-person plant in Kokomo, Indiana that makes wiring harnesses for GM is evaluating whether to shut down entirely or attempt a 2-year pivot to non-automotive customers, a pivot that requires capital the company doesn't have. These aren't companies you've heard of. They're not on the stock exchange. Their owners don't appear on television. They're small businesses, family businesses, the invisible backbone of the industrial Midwest. And they're disappearing one by one, shift by shift, canceled order by canceled order, while the politicians who created the crisis debate abstractions in Washington. So, here's where we stand. Ford lost $3.2 billion. GM lost $2.7 billion. $5.9 billion in combined damage to America's 2 most iconic manufacturers. The companies that built the assembly line won the war, created the middle class, and put a car in every American garage in just 2 weeks. Stocks collapsing. Plants on reduced shifts, 1,400 workers laid off in Dearborn alone. Canadian sales cratering as consumers switch to non-tariffed alternatives built in Canadian plants by Japanese and Korean companies. Parts supply being surgically redirected to competitors through a $2.3 billion Canadian government incentive package that is, as we speak, rewriting the supplier relationships that the North American auto industry has depended on for 40 years. Emergency sourcing at premium cost for components that may not have adequate alternatives at any price. Dealerships across Middle America watching three-generation family businesses slide toward an edge they've never been close to before. And in the small shops and family-owned suppliers that nobody talks about, the Tier 2 and Tier 3 companies in Toledo and Kokomo and 100 other towns, the lights are going out one by one, shift by shift. Canada's retaliatory strike was not broad, it was not random, it was surgical, targeted, and politically devastating, aimed with precision at the one industry Trump promised to save in the exact communities that put him in office, using the specific leverage points that would cause maximum pain to the specific companies whose workers make up Trump's most loyal industrial base. Carney's team didn't pick the auto sector by accident. They picked it because hitting Ford and GM hits Trump's promise. And a broken promise, in politics, is worse than a lost battle. Buffett called it burning down your own house to kill a mouse. He called it the most self-destructive industrial policy he's witnessed in 69 years of investing. And his warning about permanence, that redirected supply chains don't come back because you apologize, that trust broken by tariffs isn't rebuilt by reversing them, should keep every auto executive, every trade official, and every politician in the industrial Midwest awake tonight, because the clock is ticking. Every day that the tariffs remain in place, more supplier capacity shifts to Toyota and Honda. Every week, more contracts get signed with non-American automakers. Every month, the possibility of returning to the pre-tariff integrated manufacturing model gets smaller. And at some point, a point that may be closer than anyone in Washington wants to admit, the shift becomes irreversible. The tooling changes. The contracts lock in. The workers retrain. And Ford and GM discover that the supply chain they depended on for 4 decades has been permanently rerouted to their competitors. Trump campaigned in Michigan. He held rallies in auto plants. He stood in front of the workers in Dearborn and Flint and Lordstown and looked them in the eye and told them, "I will save your industry. I will bring back manufacturing. I will make the American auto industry great again." Those workers believed him. They voted for him. They put signs in their yards and stickers on their trucks and told their kids that someone in Washington finally understood what their lives were about. And his tariffs, his signature economic policy, the centerpiece of his trade agenda, the one thing he was supposed to get right for the people who believed in him most, have inflicted more damage on Ford and GM in 2 weeks than the 2008 financial crisis did in 2 years. More damage than the semiconductor shortage. More damage than the pandemic shutdowns. More damage than any foreign competitor has ever managed. The damage came from Washington, from the policy of the president they trusted, from the one person who was supposed to be on their side. He promised to save American manufacturing. Ford and GM are bleeding out, and the surgeon holding the knife is the one who promised to heal them.